Data protection's very hard. I've been involved in 4 companies, 3 of which were in the encryption business. And it's very hard to identify what should be encrypted, and even harder to understand who should be able to decrypt it. Why? It's because in general, people don't understand the value of the data, and therefore they don't know who should be able to access it, who should be able to share it with whom, and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult to manage what you don't understand and to automate that procedure, particularly across enterprises and through the cloud. It's very tough to do that, and I don't think necessarily anybody has a perfect solution for this. We're trying to help identify the value of the data such that we can streamline this process from trying to control and protect 100% of your data down to the crown jewels that you really need to protect. You need to identify it first before you can protect it. Well, we were the creators of the first DLP system back in 2001, and Ariel Peled, founder of DocAuthority, was also co-founder of Port Authority, which is where our name comes from, so it goes back to 2001. We built a DLP service to be able to identify information as it was leaving the network, and we utilized the regular expressions or common words, keywords, in order to identify what was important and what isn't. Unfortunately, that isn't necessarily enough today. You need to identify the function of the data, the value of the data. And so it's not necessarily just a keyword or two that should be the flag. It should be understanding the business value to you, and if received or given to the wrong hands or pair of hands, you need to make sure that you know what is being distributed to where and put controls on it. DLP today have lots of problems because there's lots of false positives. Their flagging information isn't necessarily important and making it unnecessarily difficult for users to collaborate. So there's an identification problem of what the data is. They're looking for words, not the business function itself or the context. And I think that's the missing element with DLP. Unstructured data represents about 80% of the data across an enterprise, which I think would surprise a number of people. The budget dollars to manage and control data has typically been put into the central database technologies that people utilize. But unfortunately, the spread of unstructured data or business files has been doubling about every 12 to 18 months. So there's heaps of information inside an enterprise, typically very old, that nobody really understands what it is, what the purpose of that information is, who can actually access it today, and so therefore it's very difficult to manage. And so people have been avoiding managing it because it hasn't been achievable until DocAuthority. Today, most companies don't know what the data is, where it is, who can see it, let alone its value. And so the purpose of DocAuthority is to identify and group business functional data together and apply a business value in dollars as a currency for you then to be able to manage based on its value. That's been very difficult to date because most people haven't agreed on the value of a particular record by its function. And now we have the ability to do that in a standardized, systematic way and make it much easier for CISOs to manage by value versus managed by keyword, which has not been working. So with the recent GDPR coming into law in May, it now is law for you to be able to identify what PII or private information that you have on individuals, and that you also have a time-bound requirement, about 30 days to respond to consumers asking you to delete everything you have on them. So there's a category of the law that says there's a right to be forgotten. So individuals can request companies that have got your data to delete it. So they have to find it first, and then they have to do what we call defendable disposal, which basically means that you understood what the data is, and you understood that it can be deleted, and it's not going to break another regulation. For instance, how long it has to be retained for in country X may be an opposing force to the privacy laws. So it's very difficult for CISOs to make big decisions because they have 30 days to do it, and they may get it wrong. So the biggest thing you have to do is to understand what that business function of the data is in order to be very comfortable that you're deleting it for the right purposes, not necessarily just because it's PII. So data management is the availability and the quality of managing the data so the right users are served the right information at the right time. And right now, users have a very difficult task finding information in the enterprise, understanding whether that version is the correct and up-to-date version that they're utilizing, and also to be able to share it with the folks that should be able to access that information. And I think those 3 points are very difficult to get right. So data management is a massive, massive problem, and unstructured data is 80% of it. And I don't believe that anybody has really tackled the problem of making sure that the right user has access to the right information at the right time. So data management is focusing on making the data valuable for your business users. Data protection may not be the objective to make your users productive. It may be just to keep it away from everybody, which is a little bit of a dilemma for a CISO. What do you say can be accessed and what do you say cannot? And unless you understand the business function of that data, you won't get it right. So that's what we're focusing on here, is data management to make your business users more productive, not necessarily just to be able to answer audit questions. Historically, nobody's really been able to identify data and its value. And we've asked users to label documents for its importance, typically a classification level. That classification level should stay with the document throughout its life cycle. Unfortunately, users don't really care about the labeling, and so they don't generally do it. So we have a classification system that's being deployed to the enterprise, but nobody's really enforcing it. So it's time to automate the process and to do it through grouping of documents by its function versus asking each user to classify each document each time. That hasn't worked. I don't believe it will work in the future. We need to utilize AI to be able to do it on behalf of the organization, not necessarily just the users. So it's very important to get the classification right because its life cycle is managed through its classification label. How can it be utilized, whether it should be encrypted, whether it should be distributed, and so on and so forth. This comes down to classification. And at this point, it's not automated enough and it's not systematic. And I think that's been the missing elements of particularly some classification tools. Some others have done fairly well, but I think there's a growing need for connecting discovery and classification as one process, not necessarily as two. So right now, it's been very difficult for most enterprises to manage their unstructured data. Now it's going to get very difficult because the information is going to not just one cloud service, but n number of cloud services. And the cloud service providers are not necessarily the owner of the data. You are. So you're asking a third party to manage one of your most valuable assets through a service level agreement that may not necessarily be focused on the value of the data, but making the data almost a commodity in terms of a service and how that is offered up to your users. You don't really know where it's going, you don't really know how it's got there, who can see it, and so on and so forth. I think that while the data is stored in a cloud service, it's probably quite safe. However, it's not designed just to be stored, it's designed to be utilized, and that information therefore is going to be accessed from n number of devices and y number of locations. So what we've really got to do is focus on the value of the data to protect the information that is the highest value to the business in terms of commercial value, and not necessarily treat users differently, but treat the data differently depending on its importance and its commercial value. This problem of managing unstructured data has been around since we first had Microsoft Office documents as a standard. So that's been over 20 years. And in that period of time, nobody really has solved the riddle of understanding what the value of the data is and what the commercial context is of these documents. Typically, keywords or regular expressions are utilized to try and understand what's inside the document. It doesn't necessarily read what the content means in terms of its business function. And that really is the difference between us and the rest, is we don't rely on regular expressions, which have a very high false sense of security, because we really don't know what the data is, so we may be securing it correctly or not. And up until today, because we use focused AI, we really do get better and better over time based on feedback from the data. What is the data telling us? So we group the information into categories that can be managed centrally. So you make one set of decisions based on the category. You don't make independent decisions for every file every time a user accesses the information. So we're very accurate, it's highly automated, and it deploys centrally. These are all the things that customers asked for when we did our homework a few years ago. So a lot of people have asked us at DocAuthority, how do you put value on the data itself? Well, the first thing we do is scan your network and put the document types into independent groups by its functionality. That then allows us to put one set of controls on the information inside that group as a single systematic approach to either classifying it as X, making sure that it has to be retained for Y number of years, and also who can have access to it in terms of access control, and so on and so forth. If you manage by groups, let's say for instance you have 50,000 documents in a group, that is one decision for 50,000 documents, whereas in the past you had to make 50,000 decisions for each document. So I think that that's the basic magnitudes of the solution that we have. It's making it, breaking it down to a very manageable group by group function, not managing it by independent files. There's three main use cases that people buy DocAuthority for. It's either defendable disposal, being able to delete what isn't of use anymore, perhaps high risk, highly toxic, so we can identify what should not be available to your users, what should be deleted. It's also what should be migrated to the applicable cloud service, so the right type of functional data is going to the right type of functional cloud application. And also, what should be highlighted to be protected, for how long, for whom, and so on and so forth. They're the three main use cases. It's about making sure that you delete what can be deleted and should be deleted. It's about making sure that you apply the right rules to what data should go to which cloud service, and also what should be protected, because certainly 100% of your data is probably impossible to protect at all times. But the top crown jewel, 5 or 6%, which is typically what we found on customer networks, is really important to manage. So you have to manage it by its sensitivity, by its value, and also what happens if it were to be lost, stolen, and how much would it cost to reproduce. These are all the factors that we can help customers identify when we group the functional data together so you can manage it centrally. Imagine you're able to identify the data by its value and then be able to manage it by its value. If you're able to identify your data assets on your network and in the cloud, perhaps you'd be able to manage it better. But also you need to have more spend. You need budget to be able to manage the data. Our tool will enable you to understand the information's value such that if you had assets, $100+ million, you can easily justify spending $3 to $4 million on tools that will help manage the data and make it available to the right users for the right reasons. But if you don't have an idea as to what the value of the data is and how important it is to your business, it's very difficult to justify spend on tools that are not necessarily going to help you manage it better. So what we can do is identify the value in terms of its data assets, and we can identify where it is, who can see it, and whether it should be controlled or protected. We can do that automatically. And I think that really helps CISOs and other IT managers be able to justify funds to spend on unstructured data, which fundamentally has been missing for some time. And now the tools are available to really understand the value to you so you can spend the right amount for the right amount of management. So today we're very focused on helping customers be data compliant with the various regulations around the world. Some are very difficult to implement. Tomorrow what we're looking to do is to focus on availability of data and making sure that the right version with the right business context and function is served up to your users somewhat predictably. And we hope to be able to do that by first identifying the data and then being able to apply rules on that data centrally. But our goal here is to make your users more productive, not necessarily just be able to identify the data's importance, but to make sure that the right role of the user is aligned to the right role of the data every time. Today, users can't access the information they need because perhaps controls have been put in place. Data is currently managed by its location, not by its value. We have to turn that upside down to make sure that the right availability for the right functional data is applied to the right users. And being able to understand that data by its function is the first step to be able to make your users more productive. And that's our focus long term.